all of your models are absolutely wrong. Power law model, absolutely stupid idea, terrible idea, okay? The fact that somebody thinks we're gonna see diminishing returns when Bitcoin's only been adopted by 0.1% of the world, and they're gonna extrapolate this data out into the next 15 years, it's a lunatic idea. It's a crazy idea. It's never gonna happen, okay? Diminishing returns, such a meme. Bitcoin volatility decreasing, also a meme. It's gonna shoot much higher in the future, much faster than most people expect. Again, it's somebody's gonna yell fire in the movie theater one day, and we've got $300 trillion global debt market that's going to try to squeeze into the 2 million Bitcoin sitting on exchanges. I mean, that just screams fireworks, volatility, unpredictability, and it screams all of your models are wrong and broken. And to model the past 15 years of Bitcoin's life when 0.1% of the world adopted it, and there was an increase in amount of supply on exchanges, that's the big one. That's the kicker. People are assuming that we're going to have increasing amount of supply on exchanges and increasing amount of Bitcoin sold in the future. It's wrong, okay? The data already changed in 2020.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Luke, because bing bong, I am back with another edition of the State of Bitcoin podcast with my man, Luke Mikic here. And Luke, we've seen 3 companies implement the strategy by putting Bitcoin on their reserve balance sheet. We've seen Metaplanet, Semlar Scientific, and DeFi Technologies. And now we've even seen Michael Dell tweet about Bitcoin. So will Dell putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet bring Bitcoin to the $64 million Bitcoin?
Well, I always get a lot of questions about my $64 million Bitcoin price prediction by the year 2030. And I think what we're seeing in the past 2 to 3 months is maybe a little bit of proof that things are different post 2020. And we've seen those 3 companies that you mentioned put Bitcoin on the balance sheet in the past 3 months. So Metaplanet has bought $10 million worth of Bitcoin, and they've continued buying Bitcoin. And just this week, they actually said they're going to be raising debt and speculative attacking the Japanese yen and going out there and buying Bitcoin. Okay. And we also, obviously, they're a smaller company. Some people will say to me, Luke, you can't look at DeFi Technologies and Metaplanet buying $6 million and $10 million worth of Bitcoin. They're tiny companies. It doesn't matter. But I will raise you guys, and I would love to point to Semler Scientific. $223 million of market cap. They're an enormous company that bought $40 million worth of Bitcoin, and they came out recently and said they're going to issue $150 million of debt to go out there and buy Bitcoin. Okay, so again, all of this has happened in the past 2 to 3 months. I think a lot of us were waiting for MicroStrategy copycats to come into the Bitcoin space for the past 4 years. I myself was shocked to find that it has taken us 4 years to really see an uptick in the number of companies getting into the space in a big way. But I think they're coming. We're kind of seeing this exponential change. I think 2024 is a really interesting year. And I think things are happening really, really rapidly. And I think a lot of people aren't seeing all of this exponential change that has happened since 2020. And they've still got their linear goggles on. They're still looking at these power law models. And I think like the USD price of Bitcoin over the past 4 years is the biggest head fake in financial markets history, okay? I do not think that the price of Bitcoin in the past 4 years has represented what the underlying fundamentals of Bitcoin have done, okay? Hash rate continued pumping, to all-time highs. A lot of people talk about this idea of a Bitcoin hash rate adjusted price. And people say typically the price of Bitcoin follows the hash rate. And there's a few interesting names in the space, like Max Kaiser and another chap who does some live streams on YouTube whose name is escaping me right now. But they actually say the price of Bitcoin should be between like $200,000 and $350,000 today, based upon what the hash rate has done over the past 2 years. Okay. Again, I could talk about all of the bullish catalysts for hours and hours. I'm going to pause there, and maybe we can get into Michael Dell a little bit more in a second.
Yeah, for sure. And, I don't know how much you know about Dell, but Dell is like one of the biggest technology companies there is. It was the Apple before Apple. So I think Michael Dell tweeting about Bitcoin is absolutely astronomical. I mean, I grew up in Austin. Michael Dell was, kind of running that town before Austin is now what Austin is. And I think, that Bitcoin influence in Austin might have something to do with what Dell is experiencing right now. Maybe some Bitcoiners have infiltrated that company, but I think it's really interesting. And you bring up Michael Saylor, right? I mean, I think Michael Saylor's one of one, truly is. He's a billionaire that really went all into Bitcoin and really shorted the US dollar. But he has a lot of billionaire buddies, and I think Michael Dell is one of those buddies who can now see the light. I mean, he's a technology guy, right? He's one of the first to get into it. So that's where I think, Michael Dell has the advantage over a company like maybe say Apple, because, Apple started with Steve Jobs and everything, and obviously rest in peace to Steve Jobs. But that's where I think Dell is going. I think, they're going to start to implement Bitcoin in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, we saw T-Mobile, we talked about it in our live stream, implement Bitcoin mining. So I think this is all coming, and it's just a matter of time. And I think the year of 2024 is the year of institutional adoption here, where we're going to see a lot more companies put it on there. So, I just can't undermine how big this is for Dell to come in and start tweeting about Bitcoin. Now, I'm going to be interested to see, what comes out of it. Maybe it's just all speculation, but I do think that, because we've seen a lot of little guys come in, we've seen their stock prices double and triple simply by announcing this, that it's just a matter of time before a big dog comes and does it like Dell, and you see the benefits.
Yeah, so Dell is a really, really interesting one. And I love that you brought it up because it does relate to the maths that we're going to go through maybe at the end of today's video, looking at how we could see a $64 million Bitcoin in today's dollars before hyperinflation. We're going to get there, but we have to discuss Dell. Michael Dell is the 10th richest man in the world. Okay, he's seriously wealthy. And like you said, like Dell Technologies was the original Apple. Like they are one of the mega behemoth technology companies in the world. And what's really interesting about Dell is their stock price has already been going parabolic this year. Their stock price isn't quite as good as Nvidia, but they are one of the better performing stocks over the past 12 to 18 months. So, I mean, I'm sure I can throw a chart up on screen after the fact. And as you can see, they've gone absolutely parabolic, which is really interesting. And what's even more interesting is the fact that Michael Dell has been selling hundreds of millions of dollars of his own stock over the past 6 to 12 months, which is really interesting. I've seen a few people on Twitter say, hang on a minute, over the past 6 to 12 months, Michael Dell's been selling a lot of his own stock. What's he been buying? And a couple of people have drawn the dots and said, is Michael Dell Mr. 100, which for those who don't know is an anonymous Bitcoin whale. I believe they're the 11th largest Bitcoin whale in the entire world today. They've actually bought something like 60 to 70,000 Bitcoin, and they've only really started buying over the past 18 months. So it was actually around the time that BlackRock initially filed or announced they were going to do a Bitcoin ETF in mid-2023. That was around when Mr. 100 started buying. Maybe it was a little bit earlier than that. So some people have said, myself included, hey, is Jeff Bezos Mr. 100? He sold $6 billion of Amazon stock in 2023 and he's partying with the Giga Chad Michael Saylor on his private yacht. Is he Mr. 100? And now a few other people have said, hang on a minute, what if Michael Dell, the world's 10th richest man, what if he's Mr. 100? He's been selling a lot of stocks. I think there's an argument there. I mean, again, maybe Michael Dell is just selling hundreds of millions of dollars of stock because the stock is going parabolic. He's just taking some profit. So again, Occam's razor, that could be the simplest explanation for this one. But a lot of other people have said, hey, he's been tweeting a lot about Bitcoin recently. He's been tweeting the Cookie Monster Bitcoin meme. He's been retweeting Michael Saylor saying that Bitcoin is, absolute digital scarcity or something like that. So again, I think it's really, really interesting. And I think if Michael Dell employed a Bitcoin strategy, I think his stock price would have to go up, okay? And I think that this is going to get the attention of the biggest regulators in the world, okay? I don't think the regulators care about Metaplanet or DeFi technologies. I don't think they're paying attention to companies just buying, $5 million worth of Bitcoin, okay? Yes, it's a big buy as well. Let's not dismiss these buys just because they're $10 million. I believe the market cap of Metaplanet before it actually bought its initial $6 million worth of Bitcoin, I think their market cap was less than $20 million. So more than that initial Bitcoin buy was like 20 to 30% of the size of their market cap. So massive, really, really big. But I don't think the regulators care about that. But I would have to think that they would have to be at least interested in Michael Dell Technologies, which has, what was it, $102 billion market cap? That was the figure we discussed in our live stream earlier in the week, looking at Michael Dell. I mean, that's a massive company. I think the regulators would have to start looking at it if they weren't in on it, and if they didn't have some sort of agreement with Michael Saylor for him to help America accumulate as much Bitcoin as they possibly can. That's potentially another rabbit hole we can go down, but I'm just going to pause there and let you back in, Brandon.
Yeah, I mean, Dell, it's interesting. I was looking at a lot of things that you were lining out there. So in the past year, Dell's stock price is up 173%. And the largest shareholder of Dell's stock was Michael Dell himself, with over 58% of that. So him selling it down, maybe you're right. He could have just been trimming some off the top. Dell has been a major company. It's been absolutely ripping. But rich guys like that, he's making enough money as it is. He's probably reinvesting it somewhere. So what is he doing with that money? It very well could be buying Bitcoin and, going on it that way. But, MicroStrategy, its market cap is 26.3 billion currently. Dell's is 4 times that. And that's, the big difference here is that MicroStrategy grew to 26.2 billion after implementing the Bitcoin strategy that they have, right? And so Dell is already a giant behemoth. So who are they going after, right? I mean, the only other tech giant that they got to go after at this point is Apple, right? I mean, maybe Apple's hit recent all-time highs, but it's also been knocked off the throne by NVIDIA. So, I mean, I think it's like, kind of some tech wars going on here where it is pretty interesting. But I think, who's going to understand Bitcoin the most? It's probably going to be technology and computer guys, right? And I mean, that's exactly what Michael Dell is. So, I mean, I think with all this being said and Michael Saylor's influence here, more people and more companies, more CEOs, they're all going to start implementing a Bitcoin strategy. And I think, like, you're 100% right. This might be a huge tipping point, and especially for the regulators too. I wonder whether you think that this could be a positive or potentially a negative if we see, maybe Michael Dell implement this, because of just, the way that Bitcoin is being spoken about now. It's not only, just within Gary Gensler or, some, Elizabeth Warren speaking negative. We now have like presidential candidates talking about Bitcoin and like crypto regulations. Obviously Donald Trump and all these others. So do you view it as a positive for potential regulation? Like, do you think that Dell implementing is just so big that there's no way that could come down hard on Bitcoin because of that? Are you looking for the best way to store your seed phrase? Well, I've got it for you. It's Stampseed. They've got the #1 punch place where you can order a full-on package where they've got every single thing. They've got all the letters. You could just get it in there. And they've got this sick hammer, which they've engineered to make it so easy for you to punch in that titanium steel plate and store your seed phrase in the most secure way possible. So go ahead and get your Bitcoin off of these exchanges and use promo code Green Candle for 15% off. They're helping power the show. They've got the Bitcoin logo. You can punch it into your seed phrase as well, if you could see it here. They've got a lot of cool stuff. And now I'm helping empower you to get your Bitcoin off an exchange utilizing Stampseed and storing your seed phrase in the most secure way possible. Now get to it. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, so I'm a big proponent of, Bitcoin accelerationism. I think everything's good for Bitcoin. I think negative regulations in America is just going to drive Hong Kong and, China and America's adversaries to adopt Bitcoin in a really, really, really big way. And I think I loved how you framed it. Is this going to begin the tech wars? Okay. Yes, exactly. Okay. Maybe this can bring us back to this discussion of $64 million Bitcoin. Now, I wrote a wild article in 2021 and I said something has changed fundamentally in Bitcoin's life for the first time ever. Before 2020, there were no Michael Saylors. There were no public companies buying Bitcoin, putting on its balance sheet. There were no superannuation funds like Mass Mutual, which bought $100 million worth of Bitcoin in 2020, December 2020. There was no nation states like Bukele putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet like they did. I said in a 2021 article, this is an inflection point. Something changed in 2020. For the first 11 years of Bitcoin's life, this was epoch number one. This was the part of the technology adoption cycle where none of the big boys, none of the big money were interested in Bitcoin at all. But in 2021, I said, I think 2020 is the inflection point, and I think we're going to reach saturation, or we're going to see Bitcoin hurdle up the steepest part of its adoption curve between 2020 and 2031. Now, a lot of people are going to say, hang on a minute, Luke, you're wrong. None of the masses are adopting Bitcoin. Now, again, that's correct, but Bitcoin has different adoption curves. I'm looking at Bitcoin, the store of value adoption curve. Bitcoin is going to have different adoption curves. You're going to have an adoption curve for medium of exchange, and this is one that's going to more reflect the masses. How many masses are using Bitcoin? How many users does Bitcoin have? I don't think this adoption curve matters. I think the most important adoption curve is how much of that $900 trillion of money in the world is adopting Bitcoin. And what are the people who control the majority of that wealth doing with Bitcoin? Are they buying Bitcoin, or are they not interested in Bitcoin? Now, I believe post 2020, all of the big money has been buying Bitcoin. And I've written that the era of 2009 to 2020, it was dominated by retail speculators. Retail speculators were 99% of the volume. But I think that from 2020 to 2031, I think this era of Bitcoin's adoption life cycle will be dominated by the big money, the institutional money, the really, really big money. So this kind of aligns a little bit with Michael Saylor's recent theory that he put out there earlier this year at Madeira. He said 2024 actually marks the beginning of the digital gold rush with Bitcoin. Now, he hasn't put any specific numbers on what this means, but he's saying that this era from 2024 to 2034 is going to be radically different to the first 15 years of Bitcoin's life. And the reason Saylor says this is because the launch of the Bitcoin ETFs have unlocked a different kind of buyer. So it's a kind of similar thesis to the one I have. And I simply ran the numbers in 2020. I looked at technological adoption curves. On average, if you look at the adoption curve of the internet, automobiles, and the smartphone, you can get an average. And you can see that on average, it takes around 10 years to go from 0% adoption to 10% adoption. Then an inflection point is reached, something changes, and it takes about the same amount of time to go from 10% adoption to 90% adoption. So that's my mental operating model for Bitcoin's store of value, monetization adoption curve. Okay. So again, that's been my thesis for 4 years. It hasn't changed. And I think all of these, public companies getting into Bitcoin in 2024 in a big way, in an accelerated timeline, is, I think, proof that things are happening pretty rapidly. And I just don't think the price is backing up the fundamentals of what is happening in Bitcoin. And I don't think any rules and regulations can stop the train that has, in my opinion, left the station.
Yeah, and I agree there. I don't think that there can be any real bad negative, things when it comes to regulations, when it comes to store of value, right? I just think that there's obviously been the attack of privacy in the US when it comes to a lot of these Lightning wallets and everything like that. I think the way that the US is trying to approach it is we don't mind you having Bitcoin. It's just we want to know where it is, and we want to make sure it's either KYC'd or stored with somebody with the SEC, whether that's BlackRock or one of these ETF products. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops and plays out. But like I said a little bit earlier, I think this is the year or the time of institutional adoption, because what are you going to hold on a company's balance sheet? Are you going to hold bonds? Are you going to hold the S&P? Are you going to hold it in cash in a high yield savings or something like that? Are you going to do any of these things? No, because you're going to be losing to inflation. You're going to fight a losing battle. And as far as a company's treasury goes, you want to keep that and save that and have that potentially help you out in the long run. And so there's really no better savings technology, especially for an institution, than Bitcoin. And I think that we're just getting to that point, and we're already starting to see it with the small guys who have essentially nothing to lose, right? So I think, if you look at it as on a country level, right? Like a Metaplanet or a Similar Scientific or DeFi Technologies, company-wise, they're pretty similar to El Salvador, right? Maybe they didn't have as much going on, but they have things that they needed to do to improve. Well, Dell is like, almost like the US at this point, right? It's a giant guy. It's got things to lose, but also like putting a little bit on the balance sheet would greatly benefit it over the long period of time. And so that's why I think, because of what they have to gain, I just see it as like a no-brainer. And I think that, with as big as Dell is, it's big enough where it could essentially, afford to make a little bit of a mistake on this and not go completely under if they decide to do that. And so that's where I think that this is going, is that, the institutional adoption's coming, and that's going to be a big aspect of it. But, I lined up about the custodians. We mentioned a little bit at the beginning about the paper attack of Bitcoin. So, do you see that as a potential fallout for what's going on here? Is that, maybe the accounting services, or maybe, the SEC and all these regulators, maybe they're not quite up to par and able to, use forensic accounting tools in order to track, is this Bitcoin actually being bought? Obviously, I don't think it's going to be as drastic as like the FTX scenario, but I still think there's a chance. Do you agree with me on that, or do you think I'm just blowing hot air at this point?
Oh no, we're going to see an FTX 2.0, and it's going to be absolutely massive. I don't know when it happens, but again, I don't want to name names, but you're going to see a massive institution bigger than FTX blow up in the future. I don't know whether this is going to be Coinbase. I don't know whether this is going to be BlackRock. I don't have any intelligence on what they're doing and whether they are messing around with paper Bitcoin. I hear a lot of people who are smarter than me in the space say, oh, but no, they're held to higher regulations. They're held to higher standards than FTX, just this, offshore bank in the Bahamas. No, they can't be doing that. But I mean, we heard all the same things about BlockFi. Oh, BlockFi is an American regulated institution. They have to be doing things the safe way. All of the big, all of the big names in Bitcoin were partnered up with BlockFi. They looked safe, they looked trustworthy, but they weren't. So again, I don't know who that entity is going to be, but we are going to see paper Bitcoin blown up in the future. We're going to see a bank blown up by paper Bitcoin. Could be a multi-$100 billion bank in the future when we're on a Bitcoin standard. Like I think that we're going to see bank runs in the future on a Bitcoin standard. We're going to see digital bank runs. We're going to see a lot bigger blowups than what we saw in FTX. So I think on the topic of paper Bitcoin, 100%. It's human greed. If somebody can corrupt the money supply and print free money for themselves, they will do it and they will try it. And I think it's going to take many decades on a Bitcoin standard before we really kind of relearn, throw out a lot of the old behaviors that, our civilization has kind of accrued over the past 400 years of fiat. Okay, we've lived on a fiat standard for, we've had central banking for 400 years. So we've had the Bank of England popped up in the early 1600s. But even for the past 5,000 years, we've largely used a gold standard, but we've always had emperors and kings who had the ability to change the money supply, whether that was clipping the edges of gold coins or, printing glass beads and taking that to Africa and diluting that money supply. We've always had the ability to attack or change the money supply. So I think we've developed this instinct around money for thousands of years. So I think it's going to take multiple decades of being locked in on a Bitcoin standard before banks and our civilization realizes, hang on a minute, maybe it's just best we don't F with the money supply. It might take a while, but 100% agree. We're going to see some big blowups.
Yeah, and I think you're right on that. It's just like a matter of time, and it's unfortunate. I think it'll be the greed, and I think it's partially because I think the low barrier of entry too, with like the crypto tokens and everything like that, and just the fault of people just trusting too much, I think, at this point. So I think it'll be interesting, but I want to get back to the institutional adoption, right? Because we were talking about Dell. Obviously it's a behemoth, and that's kind of been like the whole center of the conversation. But from the Metaplanet, the DeFi, and the smaller guys, why do you think that that's a big deal? Because that's essentially like, I don't know, comparing like me and you to maybe Michael Dell buying Bitcoin at this point, right? So why do you say that is such a big deal, and you think that should be looked at more? Are you looking for the easiest way to get your Bitcoin off an exchange? Well, I've got it for you. It's Foundation Devices. They've got the #1 hardware wallet in the Passport. They've even got a concierge service that can help you get your Bitcoin off an exchange within 1 hour private onboarding session. And they've got a great app too, which will give you extremely private features on that app so you can use Bitcoin in the most secure way possible. So I've been working hard trying to get sponsors to help you get your Bitcoin off an exchange, and I found it with Foundation, and you can store your seed phrase with a Stampseed punch plate as well. So pair all those together, use promo code GREENCANDLE at foundation.xyz, and you'll get $10 off your entire order. All right, that's enough for me. Back to the show.
It's just simple math. There's just not enough Bitcoin on exchanges for everyone to do it. There's 2 million Bitcoin exchanges. There's 58,000 public companies. There's 2,000 billionaires, 60 million millionaires. We run through the numbers all the time, and it's just simply not enough Bitcoin for everybody to want to do that. And the fact that Metaplanet and Semler Scientific, that's a big deal. For them to buy $40 million of Bitcoin with nearly pretty much all of their cash reserves and say that they're going to issue $150 million of stock to buy more Bitcoin, that's massive. Like that is big. That is really big. But it's the conviction from the Metaplanets and the DeFi technologies. Yes, they've only bought $6 million and $10 million worth of Bitcoin, but they're large, like 20 to 30% chunks of their market cap. Okay, they're big bets, and it's that conviction that for me is really interesting, and that's what's going to actually raise eyebrows. People in the institutional world, they're going to yawn and they say, "Oh, some idiot just bought $6 million worth of Bitcoin. What an idiot. Who cares? What's this company, DeFi Technologies in Canada or Metaplanet? Just a Japanese company called Metaplanet. I don't care." But there's going to be some people who are actually switched on who do more than 30 seconds of cursory research for themselves, and they just Google the market cap. What is the market cap of Metaplanet? Oh, it's only 15 million. They just bought $7 million worth of Bitcoin. That's interesting. And I think there's going to be some people who do the math and they say they're pretty big bets for those small companies. And they're going to say, what do they know? Maybe that crazy man, Michael Saylor, who just, he just 25x the market cap of MicroStrategy in the past 4 years. Maybe he was onto something, because all of a sudden Michael Saylor is not alone. Okay. It's been very easy for a lot of these billionaires and public companies to dismiss Saylor. And they say, oh, it's just one crazy billionaire who lost $6 billion in a day way back in the year 2000 when the tech bubble crashed. He's just doing a crazy bet or a crazy publicity stunt to bring his stock price back from the dead, and he's going to exit pump. Like that's the common consensus for a lot of clowns and goons in the billionaire space and the tech space and the institutional space. But now that we have these other companies, even though they're small, the fact that they're coming in size with conviction, that for me, that's alarm bells. That is somebody screaming fire in the movie theater. Okay, there are very small doors in the movie theater, and if that puppy's packed, what you're going to see is like, once that toothpaste is out of the tube, she's out, baby, and it is on. And there's only 2 million Bitcoin sitting on exchanges. So I really think the race is on. I love Saylor's framing of this 10-year digital gold rush. That's what we're in right now. The ETFs went live January 2024. I think we're in a 10-year digital gold rush. I've been looking at the number of Bitcoin on exchanges. I've been screaming about it since 2021. I was a nutcase in 2021 when I wrote that article. And I said, look, something's changed. For the past 18 months, we've seen coins leave exchanges. I'm saying, hey, I'm coming out there. I'm early, but is this data suggesting that something's changed? Are we witnessing different buyers adopt Bitcoin? And since then, we've got now 4.5 years of data showing that coins have been leaving exchanges and the big money continues to buy Bitcoin. So I don't know the original source of that question, Brandon, but I'm pretty bullish by institutional adoption. And I think it is the conviction of these Metaplanets, Semler Scientifics, that's really piquing the interest of people like Michael Dell. And I would have to guess, just guessing, but I would have to guess that Jeff Bezos is in Bitcoin. Mark Zuckerberg has a goat called Bitcoin and Max. So again, I think the next couple of years are going to be really spicy.
Yeah, and I agree with you there. But I'm curious, what do you think is more important, or more, I guess, more of a going to be a driver here in the next few years? Do you think it's going to be, we've obviously seen Millet kind of come up and talk about Bitcoin, and obviously El Salvador, right? Do you think that it's going to be more country adoption, or more institutional adoption that's going to be the real driver in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so that is actually a really, really good question. It's a really difficult one. I personally think it's going to be more institutional led. I think it's more likely you're going to see more public companies really get into the space. This trend that we're witnessing in early 2024, I'm going to go on record and I'm going to be absolutely shocked if we do not see another public company do the same thing that MicroStrategy, Metaplanet, Semler Scientific, and DeFi Technologies has done in the past 3 months, and that is buy tens of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. Okay. So again, I think we're going to see another one of those in the next 3 months. Big call, big bet. I don't do short-term price predictions. I hate those, trading channels and, buy this token to 1,000x your net worth. It's all bullshit. But I think the trend is clear. And I really do think we're going to have a big year this year. I think it's going to be led by public corporations. Like we talked about in a live stream a while ago, 13 of the world's biggest 25 hedge funds have bought Bitcoin. So that is more than half of the world's top 25 hedge funds have bought Bitcoin. Some people will say, oh, but they're trading it. Yeah, sure. Some could just be trading it. Some might just be trading the basis trade. But for every 10 clowns who are just trading Bitcoin thinking it's a risk-on asset, I reckon there's one who gets it. There's one company who'll come in and get it. And that is what those public companies we've talked about today have shown and demonstrated: conviction. So again, I think now nation states is a really interesting topic. I think Nayib Bukele is literally decades ahead of the rest. It's really difficult. I thought that we would have seen more nation states come into Bitcoin in 2021. I was wrong. And the more I've kind of thought about this, I think it's unlikely that we see another nation state, plow, $40 million of the country's treasury into Bitcoin. I think that's going to be more rare. I think what's going to be more common is just friendly regulations. You're going to see countries say zero taxes on your Bitcoin. Come and live here with your Bitcoin. You can spend your Bitcoin here. We'll let you spend it. We'll be friendly to Bitcoin merchants and we won't attack you. I think that's going to be more common. But again, I have a higher probability than most people on seriously extreme outcomes happening this decade. Like if Qatar came out tomorrow and said that they're sitting on $1 million Bitcoin, or if Saudi Arabia came out next week and said, we're never going to accept US dollars again, we've been squatting on 1 million Bitcoin for the past 4 years, that wouldn't surprise me. Like I genuinely believe that there are very large nation states in the world today mining Bitcoin, buying tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of Bitcoin. Some people will say I'm crazy, but let me tell you, if a country with only 500,000 people called the Kingdom of Bhutan has been mining Bitcoin since 2019, and they've been buying hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Bitcoin on BlockFi and Celsius, there has to be other bigger nation states doing the same. And I think they've been doing it for longer than the Kingdom of Bhutan has been doing it. So again, I think we've got all the data there out there in the public sphere. But again, your original question was what's going to drive adoption over the next couple of years? Public companies, institutions, hedge funds, insurance funds. That's what's going to drive adoption. But be prepared. I think a lot of people think that Qatar coming out next week or next month and saying, hey, we got 1 million coins. Most people put that probability at 0.1%. I'm probably someone who puts it at 5%. Still think it's unlikely, but it's at a much higher probability than most, and everything is a probability. This is something that so many people get wrong in the space. They get married to their ideas. They never change their mind. They never admit when the data starts to change. So again, that's kind of my views on what's going to drive what over the next few years.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you 110%. And I think that the bigger reasoning behind that is just more of like back to the regulation part is like for a country to implement a Bitcoin strategy, it just simply takes longer. There's more lobbying. Like governments are built to be inefficient, right? I mean, like in the United States, we have so many different checks and balances that, it could get passed through the House, then it's got to go through the Senate. It's going to take months and months and months for things to get through. And then they send it in these stack of bills that are, way bigger than you and I, big ass heads over here. So, I mean, I think that's just going to continue. Like in governments, like I said, are not meant to be speedy and quick. The benefit that Bukele had was that El Salvador is a very small country, and he was able to move quick. But the difference is like at a company, right? Especially a publicly traded one, like maybe you got to go to a board of 7 to 12 people or whatever it is, and you just got to get a majority vote. You got to convince a lot smaller amount of people is basically the point of it. And, a lot of these smaller companies, it's like, what do we have to lose at this point, right? Our savings are getting depleted on our balance sheet. So an institution and adopting it just makes sense. And, with all the publicity that they're seeing, they've seen their stock prices shoot up. So, I mean, if even if they're wary at the beginning, the board members will surely be happy when they see their net worth of their stock price, like essentially just double. So I think it's just like, you're right, a matter of time before more institutions go and adopt it. And I'd be very surprised if we don't see another institution adopt a Bitcoin treasury strategy this year. On the flip side, too, I'd be very surprised if we see another nation adopt it, right? I mean, we saw Argentina. That was kind of like the next cog to maybe fall, but then they're getting towards a dollar standard first before maybe they're getting over there. So I think, yeah, like we've been saying, it's more of an institutional adoption here, and we're going to see more Michael Saylor copycats pop up. But I think that leads to some worry for other aspects and other avenues, right? I mean, it's essentially like a speculative attack on fiat currencies and the banking systems. So with all that, like, a major company not holding a lot of money in, small regional banks, that kind of has me worried when we've already kind of seen some of the cracks in the regional banking system that we have in the US already. Now, I'm not quite sure how that regulation quite works with like, the Coinbase custodian and everything like that. But do you think that that's a potential, I guess, like, thing that companies need to start to worry about is that, okay, the fiat that they have to exchange, they're paying their employees on, maybe is not exactly super safe in the banking system. Obviously, we saw Silicon Valley Bank and all that. But do you think that's a potential next cog or downfall for implementing a Bitcoin strategy? Are you looking for the number one place to find all the information you can about Bitcoin, whether it's price, whether it's hash rate, whether it's the latest up-to-date things outside of Bitcoin, whether it's nation state adoption, what have you? Well, I've got the place for you. Check out bitcoinnews.com. They've even got the number one newsletter in the game when it comes to Bitcoin, because it gives you all the up-to-date information on every single thing that happened in the past week. That'll come to your inbox every single Monday morning. You could sign up using this code right down here or this link. It's also in the show notes. So come join me and thousands of other people that are getting the most up-to-date information from bitcoinnews.com and their newsletter. All right, let's get back to the show.
Okay, 2 points I want to address. If I get lost, reel me in and remind me of that second question. First point was about, public companies adopting Bitcoin versus nation states adopting Bitcoin. You mentioned the fact that public companies have an incentive to adopt Bitcoin because, as you correctly said, their stock price has been pumping after they bought the Bitcoin. So the free market is validating everybody's ideas. Semler Scientific up 50% in a month after they announced the $40 million Bitcoin buy. Metaplanet, stocks tripled. Well, actually, the stock's up by like 5x in the past 3 months because they adopted a Bitcoin standard. Same with DeFi technologies. MicroStrategy, we don't even need to run the numbers. Where their market cap's gone from 1.3 billion in 2020 to over $25 billion today. It's like a 16x in market cap. Massive. So public companies are being validated. And as you asked me that question, I went and checked the price of the stock price of Semler Scientific and Metaplanet, and they actually haven't had large corrections over the past 2 weeks. At the time of recording, Bitcoin dipped below $58,000 yesterday. Bitcoin was down, 16 to 17% from its all-time high. But what's fascinating is these public companies, which should be trading at, as higher beta on Bitcoin, they're not. Their stock price continues to look pretty strong. They've had little dips, but nothing like the 17% dip of Bitcoin. So I think that's interesting. That's a nugget. But what you made me think of there when you mentioned that in your question was, with a nation state, when Bukele bought Bitcoin, there's no stock price for a nation state that tells you live in the free market what the free market actually thinks about that country adopting Bitcoin. So when Metaplanet announced their Bitcoin buy, their stock price is up 50% in a day, right? And even that little gold mining company that we haven't actually talked about today, Nylon Resources, when they announced that they were going to try to acquire something like 26,000 Bitcoin by buying this other micro cap company, their stock price went bananas, okay? But you don't see that with nation state adoption because there's no share price, which is interesting. All you did see was the mainstream media attack El Salvador. So other public companies are watching competitors have their stock prices pumped by adopting Bitcoin, but other nation states are looking at El Salvador getting aggressively attacked in the mainstream media by, for adopting Bitcoin. And not just the mainstream media, the IMF, American politicians, the American government, everyone from all around the world has been attacking El Salvador. But what's interesting is we do have a metric to look at what the free market thinks about El Salvador, and that is tourism rates. What we did see, tourism rates skyrocket in the years after Bitcoin was made legal tender. So again, it's not as good as public markets where you can see instantly what the free market thinks about a Bitcoin allocation. We have a little bit more of a lagging metric, but I do think nation states kind of have a quasi stock price, so to say. If you want to check their ticker, go there, boots on the ground, check out the country, and also look at their tourism rates and their economic growth rates, GDP rates, and all of that. So that's part one of what you mentioned. Now I asked you to reel me back in with part two, and I've forgotten. What was the second part of the question?
Part two was more on like the banking system, right? Because like if we're seeing an attack on the dollar, a lot of these like large, especially like regional banks in the US, and I'm sure like regional banks like everywhere, their biggest clients are companies. And if you're taking the money away from these banks that's already kind of seen some issues, that could just like further accelerate the demise of a lot of these banking systems. And I'm not a fan of the banking system or anything like that, so don't get it convoluted here. But this would cause like a bigger crash, I think, in the end, where it could lead to more damage than it could lead to good initially, right? In the short term, it would not be very good to see a bunch of these banks collapse. So do you think that that's a potential pitfall, or do you think I'm just blowing smoke at this point, and that is not a potential worry?
Great question. I think like events like Silicon Valley Bank collapsing in 2023 is just going to highlight, especially to the tech companies that had money in the bank at the time, it's going to tell them that they need to adopt Bitcoin. They need to have an alternative solution to meet payroll in case a bank collapses, okay? Like we're living in volatile times. Like the bank collapses we saw in March of 2023 were bigger than the bailouts and the collapses we saw in the 2008 global financial crisis. So I think we're in volatile times. Everybody needs a hedge. And I think the banking system is more shaky than ever. I think we've got more debt in the system than we had in 2008. Central banks are acting differently today, which is interesting. They are acting a lot more proactively, but which has put me and my base case for the past 4 years since I've been writing and making videos about Bitcoin and macro. I've been more on the melt up case for stocks. I've kind of been more on the inflation, and we're going to see higher inflation for longer. That's been my base case for the past 4 years. So far, that's been proven right, but I still think there's significant risk for, very volatile and very seriously scary deflationary shocks. Now, I just don't think they're going to last long if we see deflationary shocks. I think we saw in 2020, stock markets crashed for 3 weeks in March of 2020. The treasury market sold off for about 4 days, and then the Fed stepped in and announced unlimited money printing, okay? That reaction in only 3 to 4 weeks was the quickest reaction ever, okay? In 2007, 2008, it took months, 6 months of haggling, and, it took a very, very long time to get that $700 billion bailout. And again, more recently, in 2023, we saw the Fed step in with the BTFP, the Bank Term Funding Program, or as our mutual friend Greg Foss calls it, the Buy the Fucking Dip program. That got launched in literally days after these banks started collapsing in March of 2023. So my base case for the past 4 years is, yes, there's serious cracks in the banking system, but central banks are acting differently, which is interesting. And this has kind of put my base case more on, a hyperinflationary melt up of fiat currencies all around the world.
Hey, and I'm with you on that. I mean, we're seeing it right in front of our eyes right now, right? I mean, we're seeing inflation running, we're seeing stock prices rip, we're seeing Bitcoin up over 100% in the past year. So I think that that's going to continue as well. Like, I mean, there's a lot of cracks under the surface. I think when you go and dig deep into the consumer, you dig deep into, all these things, there's a lot of like macro events that could potentially happen. And I think like the banking one is one of those to fall. But, we're sitting here really bullish on Bitcoin and adoption, right? Because there's obviously a lot of issues in the current fiat system. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Luke, because, we do have, like, we're lining it out. There is a lot of issues, right? I mean, the system is cracking. It is failing. Now, do you think that this system is going to be basically like big enough to send us right into a Bitcoin adoption where we're going to have a huge degradation of the society and just need to basically use Bitcoin as a lifeboat, and it would take, maybe years, decades to get out of that? Or do you see it as more of like a slow transition over this next decade where we see first institutional adoption, then maybe some more nation state adoption, and then, the retail kind of comes in behind all that in order to, become, maybe a Bitcoin standard globally? Are you looking for the best way to orange pill your friends and family? Well, I've got a way for you that's got a little bit of a nostalgia factor. I've got Bitcoin trading cards. They've got the Genesis pack. I've got an open pack right here, sitting here, where you can hand out a bunch of these cards with some great, great artwork. We've got tyranny. We've got fear, uncertainty, and doubt right here, the FUD card. So we've got a lot of great things to teach you a bunch of lessons about Bitcoin in the current space. And they've even got some cool things of cool people even doing some stuff in the Bitcoin space. I've got the Bitcoin racing card here, even signed by my boy, Chris Primetime McKenzie. So you can get all of that at btc-tc.com. Use promo code GreenCandle. You can get 10% off your entire order to orange pill your friends and family and collect some cool artwork of people that are doing some awesome stuff in the Bitcoin space and help spreading that orange pill around the globe. All right, enough from me. Back to the show.
Great question. You have put me on the spot there. You got me a good one. I think nobody's prepared for volatility. I think we're going to see a lot more volatility than most people expect. I don't know how hyper-Bitcoinization is going to happen, but I think it's going to happen in a lot more of a volatile fashion than most people. That's just typically down to, Bitcoin's scarcity and, the fact that our government can't really control Bitcoin. I mean, sure, they can use propaganda to, try to suppress the price as much as possible, but that can only work for so long. And eventually you're just going to see a rocket ship. I believe that, all of your models are absolutely wrong. Power law model, absolutely stupid idea, terrible idea, okay? The fact that somebody thinks we're going to see diminishing returns when Bitcoin's only been adopted by 0.1% of the world, and they're going to extrapolate this data out into the next 15 years, it's a lunatic idea. It's a crazy idea. It's never going to happen, okay? Diminishing returns, such a meme. Bitcoin volatility decreasing, also a meme. It's going to shoot much higher in the future, much faster than most people expect. Hyper-Bitcoinization, I talk a lot and people say, oh, you're just a hopium dealing, moon boy. But I put my money where my mouth is. Like I left Australia in 2022 and I haven't gone back. And that is largely because I don't know what's going to happen in the future. We're living through the most uncertain time in human history. This decade in the 2020s is such a volatile decade. I mean, another reason for why I think we could see tens of millions of dollars, a price tag for Bitcoin by 2031 is because of this long-term debt cycle. So every 80 years, when governments become over-indebted, they have to deal with their debt load. They have to deleverage their balance sheet in one way, shape, or form. Hirschman Capital, they ran a great report in 2020. They looked at the past 220 years economic data. they said 52 countries have reached debt to GDP levels of 130% or higher. And 51 of those countries defaulted on their debt within 15 years of reaching that 130% debt to GDP Rubicon. So I thought, that's interesting. The US, the global reserve currency holder, they hit that Rubicon in 2020. So what's 15 years after then? Well, it's about 2035, right? So the global reserve currency holder has a 98.6% probability of defaulting on its debt before 2035. Some people will say, but the US dollar is the global reserve currency. They can never default on their debt. The financial system is structured differently. We have the euro dollar system. I agree with all of that. So then I make the case, hang on a minute, it's not just the United States that has this 130% debt to GDP problem. A lot of other countries do as well. So all throughout Europe, most people will be familiar with the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. All of those countries have debt to GDPs of above 150%. We've got countries like Turkey, Argentina, Venezuela. They're all blowing up their currencies all around the world. So again, I'm a dollar milkshake maximalist. But the fact that we have more than 10 countries around the world with debt to GDP ratios above 130%, I think we're going to see a global fiat default within 15 years of when I started really paying attention to this stuff and when the United States dollar or the US government reached that 130% debt to GDP ratio in 2020. So again, a lot of people say, but you can't just call Bitcoin a technology. You can't just apply this adoption curve onto Bitcoin's store of value. But it's not just, the technology lens that is a part of my $64 million Bitcoin thesis, so to say. It's also the fact that Bitcoin's competitor, Fiat, is getting exponentially worse. And we have all of this data suggesting 10 of the world's largest economies will default on their debt by 2035. So again, like all of these adoption curves in the past, they happen really rapidly. Like phase 1, phase 2, we've talked about it. But in these adoption curves, their competitors were never getting exponentially worse while they were being adopted. That's what's happening with Bitcoin. Bitcoin's being released during like the most volatile period of this 80-year long-term debt cycle. We're in the 10 to 15-year deleveraging phase of this long-term debt cycle where the government has to deal with its debt burden. So fiat's getting exponentially worse. We've seen the biggest inflation spike for 50 years. This is the first inflation spike in the digital age. So who knows how quickly a loss in faith of fiat currency could happen. I think it could happen pretty quickly. And Bitcoin is just the competitor there. It's somebody's going to yell fire in the movie theater one day. And we've got $300 trillion global debt market that's going to try to squeeze into the 2 million Bitcoin sitting on exchanges. I mean, that just screams fireworks, volatility, unpredictability, and it screams all of your models are wrong and broken. And to model the past 15 years of Bitcoin's life when 0.1% of the world adopted it, and there was an increase in amount of supply on exchanges. That's the big one. That's the kicker. People are assuming that we're going to have increasing amount of supply on exchanges and increasing amount of Bitcoin sold in the future. It's wrong, okay? The data already changed in 2020. In 2020, we saw that people began to accumulate Bitcoin and Bitcoin began leaving exchanges. 35% of all the Bitcoin on exchanges has actually evaporated in the past 4 years, okay? So a long answer. I hope there was some sort of insights in that answer, but I think all of your models are wrong. All of your models are broken. Nobody knows how hyper-Bitcoinization is going to play out. Nobody knows whether your local government is going to turn tyrannical and really oppose Bitcoin holders and even chase down Bitcoin holders. I mean, I was called a domestic terrorist in Australia for refusing to wear a face diaper on my face and choosing for what goes into my body. I mean, some people think, hey, my government's going to love me because I'm a Bitcoiner. Geez, I wouldn't be so confident in that opinion and trusting of governments when they've shown us in the past 4 years that they're tyrants. They don't respect your freedom. And if you openly call yourself a Bitcoiner in public, nobody knows what the future is going to hold. So just prepare yourself for unpredictability.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think the volatility is going anywhere. And I think the more that we print money, the more that, that volatility is going to affect Bitcoin. But, we've talked about a little bit about the debt spiral here. And I think the lifeboat for the U.S. potentially to get out of that, obviously, I'm speaking about the U.S. because, the dollar is a global reserve currency right now, would be to put Bitcoin on the country's like global treasury, right? So do you think that would kind of help give the lifeboat and maybe, in a sense, turn some heads, and that would be like the great driver where we see that gradually then suddenly when it comes to the store of value adoption where we see the US starting to utilize Bitcoin to help pay off the debt that seemingly will never end.
Yeah, so this idea of the US adopting Bitcoin is a really, really fascinating one. I'm going to go down two different rabbit holes, two different tangents. First one would have to be Bitcoin milkshake theory. Now, we actually filmed an interview talking about how the US might actually weaponize the US dollar by aggressively raising interest rates. That's Tom Luongo's thesis, which I'm a massive fan of. And I still think he's on the money with that thesis, even while a lot of people are screaming, oh, Powell's pivoted. He's talking about a pivot. Well, not so fast. He hasn't pivoted yet. And, so again, there's the dollar milkshake theory, there's the Tom Luongo theory, and there's the Bitcoin milkshake theory, which we did an interview on a while ago. So the people want to know about the Bitcoin milkshake theory and how America might actually weaponize the US dollar by backing it with Bitcoin, go and watch our old interview on this channel. But something else that's interesting to me is I got a phone call from potentially the most bullish Bitcoiner in the space a few months ago, Peter Dunworth. One night he calls me, it was about 11 p.m. my time. I was a bit yawning, I was sleeping, I was laying around, I was stretching my back on a foam roller because I'm a little bit of an old man. My day was done. But Peter called me up and he goes, Luke, got this really interesting idea I want to bounce off you. And he told me this really interesting idea for how the US government might actually deal with its debt burden. And he was talking about how the US might actually sell bonds in the future that are partially backed by Bitcoin, right? So it's a fascinating idea. And this kind of idea has been percolating for a while. And, I always listen to Peter's every interview that he does. I listen to it because he's just full of insights. He's full of nuggets of gold, that Peter Dunworth. And then I had a conversation with Luke Broyles in Prague recently. We did an interview together. And Luke said something along a similar vein that really struck me. He said, America doesn't have a debt problem. America has a demand problem. So America has $34 trillion of debt. That's not a problem if the world's buying the debt, okay? So again, America could hypothetically print $220 trillion to pay all of its unfunded liabilities. That's about how much the country has, roughly. And that would be fine if there's $220 trillion of demand for that debt in the world. So that's an interesting perspective. And the way Luke framed it, it really caught me off guard, and it really did make me think a little bit. Because, the problem with America is this debt to equity ratio. So the country has no equity, or has no cash reserves. There's no gold, there's no Bitcoin, there's no bearer asset. The whole country's debt. Yeah, so this is the biggest misconception that people have in the world, okay? America doesn't have a debt problem, has a demand problem, okay? And they could even fix the debt problem by just simply raising the equity in the country, okay? So that's the problem. The problem is America has $34 trillion of debt. If they had $34 trillion of debt and $34 trillion of Bitcoin on the balance sheet, no problem, right? They've got a balanced equity to debt problem. But the problem is you have $34 trillion of debt. You've got $220 trillion of unfunded liabilities. And you've only got, how much gold does America have? I don't think they have the gold they're sitting on and they claim to have in Fort Knox. But they don't have any bearer assets, okay? They don't have any cash. They don't have any gold. They don't have any Bitcoin. That's the problem, okay? But if they start actually backing the debt by bearer instruments, and all of a sudden they can start actually fixing this debt to equity ratio, and they can bring the equity up of the country, America, I think, can pull a rabbit out of the hat. And as I wrote in 2022, I don't think it's a good idea to write off the US government. Everybody wrote the US off in the 1970s. They said the US dollar is going to hyperinflate, 1971, Nixon shock, it's going to, the US dollar is dead. But, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, interesting character that we can probably explore in another video, they flew to Saudi Arabia and they pulled an economic rabbit out of the hat. an economic wild card. That's what I called it in that article. And I think backing the US dollar with even just some US treasuries, with a portion of Bitcoin, I think that is going to be a similar economic wild card that America will play in the future, that I think will help extend the life of the US dollar's reign as the global reserve currency longer than most people think is possible.
There we go. I love it. Yeah, and I think that would, definitely like help the U.S. in the long term, and I think that would help like just kind of bring the country back, man. I think it would help a lot here, and like in a sense like weaponize the U.S. dollar. And yeah, we did have a great rip on it back then. So I wanted to see if your opinion changed, but I'm glad to see that it stuck with it. So Luke, you've been very generous with your time coming on for, I think, what is it, your third or fourth appearance here, so you might be the most on the state of Bitcoin here. So for those that have missed you, why don't you tell them where they can find you and what else you got going on?
Hey, so firstly, thanks again for having me. Really, really appreciate it. I think since our last chats, I've been going a lot harder on YouTube. So I'm always talking shit from my personal YouTube channel, and I'm doing a lot more, let's say, professional deep dives and analysis over on the bitcoinnews.com YouTube channel. I'm also making all the videos over there, and I'm having an absolute blast with the lads at bitcoinnews.com. So I'm talking a lot about Bitcoin. I'm doing a little bit of shit posting on Twitter. And if you got any questions, if you want to tell me I'm crazy or tell me why I'm wrong, or, encourage me to investigate another rabbit hole, reach out to me. Twitter's probably the best space. So reach out to me there, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you got.
100%. And I'll put all that in the show notes. And Luke, thanks so much. Thanks so much for tuning in to this great episode. If you enjoyed this one and you want some more content, click on the link right here and check out my latest interview with Tom Luongo. We get into it all. If you've known Tom, he's a wild one, so stay tuned. And if you found some value in this podcast, please smash that like button, hit that subscribe button so you get notified of the next videos. All right, I'll catch you at the next one.